here? All right, so we have talked a lot about, from the perspective of women of color entrepreneurs sharing their insights, and we've heard from folks who have, achieved a certain level of success as women of color entrepreneurs and investors. And a lot of the conversation oftentimes is what we are able to achieve at the level of access that we have versus white men, right? That's always kind of the default to versus, white men. And as I started, whoops, that's not good. As I started thinking about that, at a point, and you'll hear in soon kind of how we even came to this conversation, but as I started thinking about that, I said, there shouldn't necessarily be an us versus them. We need to, kind of foster understanding. What I've also come to understand is oftentimes we just don't put the issues really out there and have the conversations in a frank and honest way. So I'm fortunate enough to have relationships with some white men who are willing to have the conversation and engage in the conversation, and who I have talked to about certain things, or they've come to me and said, hey, what do you think? Or I'm having issues, we're trying to hire some people at the firm and not going so well, what do you think? And I think that that's great, because I think that that's what we really need. So I would like to bring up our next panel, and this is a continuation kind of the conversation on the other end, so to speak. So I'd like for Mitch Kahn, Doug Zacher, and Bill Craze to come on up. Hey, we needed some music for that entrance, but that's okay.
It's so lackluster there. I want your music.
Okay, wait. Try that again. Let's go off the stage, come back on the stage. All right. You ready to get started, guys? All right, terrific. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for being here. Much appreciated. So I want to start off first, just if each of you can tell, who you are and what you do, but keep that to one sentence.
One sentence.
All right, two.
No. My name is Doug Zacher, and I produce and host a podcast called The Righteous Capitalists, which is a podcast where I interview business owners who run their businesses in a way that equitably distributes the gains of that business. So just really, really good business people who treat their communities well, their employees well, and they make money in the process. Brand new episode today with Mitch, and the last episode had Jill. Oddly enough, I met them each in completely different circumstances. But please, you could find it on every single podcast platform that's out there.
Thank you.
So Doug sucks up to his co-panelist here by getting him on his podcast. Very impressive. Hi folks, my name is Bill Craze. I'm an attorney with the law firm in Morristown by the name of Porzio, Bromberg, and Newman. I have known Jill for as long as our boys were playing baseball together. Jill was that crazy parent and I was the coach, and we managed to survive that, and I'm thankful that she's brought me here today. Thanks, Jill.
My name is Mitch Kahn. I'm the president and founder of Unionware. We're a manufacturing company in Newark, about 180 employees. Been in business for 28 years. Manufacture baseball hats and backpacks and all sorts of sewn items. We're known right now because we're manufacturing most of the merchandise for presidential campaigns who are looking for products made in America. And I've known Jill as we were both involved in a lot of the economic development in the city of Newark for the last decade or so, and ended up being her neighbor.
Thank you. Well, bless you over there. So Doug, let's start out and tell the story of how we came to meet, and share your perspectives on that interaction.
Wow, you're just going to make me tell this over and over and over. So, about how do I start? So when I started producing this podcast, in my head, I most definitely wanted very diverse guests on. I networked in a way that would get diverse guests. I made a commitment to myself that I wouldn't launch unless I had 2 women guests already sort of in the pipeline of the 7 episodes that I was going to produce before going live. And I did that, but about 10 episodes in, I realized my guests were 80% white men, and the other 20% were white women. So I was worse than your typical Fortune 500 board of directors, which is something that on the podcast we sort of rail against, because that is not the way to create a very sustainable business that benefits lots of stakeholders, or every stakeholder. So Jill kind of popped up on my LinkedIn screen, sort of on the side of kind of people you may want to know. And here I saw a black woman who runs an organization called the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership in Newark. And I thought, and she knew 56%, or excuse me, we had 56 connections in common. So I thought, a black woman who works in Newark with entrepreneurs, those are the people that I want to talk to, and we know lots of the same people, so I could easily get an introduction to her. So I had a mutual friend introduce us. To this day, Jill laughs at the notion that I sort of wanted a warm introduction. I always thought that's the best way to be introduced, right?
I was very flattered, like, oh my gosh, someone's trying to meet me.
Little did I know that Jill is probably one of the easiest people to meet. And I didn't know anything about Jill going into it. And we got on the phone, and I have to say, it was sort of instantly an awkward moment for me. I think somewhere deep inside, or not even all that deep, I felt a little dirty going to Jill because she was a black woman and talking to her about trying to introduce me to other black women. And the way the conversation went, Jill left a lot of silence out there, which left a lot of
Put
room.
it that way, Doug, I'm not surprised.
Which left me kind of stumbling and fumbling for kind of how to put things. And here I am. I grew up with 3 older sisters, single mom. I have 3 daughters. My wife is Latina. I mean, I'm used to being in kind of diverse settings and being very comfortable in them. But for whatever reason, my conversation with Jill ended up being so incredibly awkward because of something in me. But luckily, Jill accepted me for who I was. And we ended up going out for breakfast. I came to realize, really, I probably would have been better off sending her an email saying, let's just go to breakfast and meet face to face. Something about that phone call was very awkward. And have had a wonderful relationship since, even to the point where she was on The Righteous Capitalist talking about this exact issue, sort of using my example of deliberately trying to have diverse guests, but failing at it miserably. Her and I talk about that on the podcast and kind of how we can all address that.
Yeah, and what made it awkward really, and what I went back to him and kind of put the challenge on him, I said, so, he said, hey, so can you introduce me to some folks? And I thought for a second, one of those silent moments, and I said, no, I can't. I don't trade in black women entrepreneurs. So now I'm going to dial up and say, hey, I need 3 black entrepreneurs for this thing. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, now I would be happy to go on your podcast. And he immediately was kind of, well, no, I only interview entrepreneurs. And I said, okay, well, so where does that leave us? I don't know. He called me back and said, I thought about it, and I'd like to have you on. And he asked what was the problem with what I did, because he thought he was doing the right thing, and he was doing the right thing, at least trying and being intentional, thinking about it. I said, but it was the way in which you went about it, it was very transactional. It was like, hey, dial up, and I think that's what kind of gave you that feeling. It was like, oh, dial up, and it's like, now what am I asking for? Hey, Joe, can I get 3 Black women entrepreneurs? And so, you know, that has led to, again, this relationship and where he attends one of our events, and you then end up meeting people when you actually become part of someone else's network and you're integrated into their network. So, you know, I want to kind of have that, now let's turn it kind of into the mindset. And I think it's, the question kind of is like, oh, everyone wants to know, again, we always talk about white men and what they're able to, you know, do and achieve, etc. Is there a mindset, being a white male, that, you know, anything and everything is possible? Is everything on the table? Is there a different mindset as a white male?
So I didn't realize that I had a mindset. And then I realized that maybe that was the mindset, that I have the luxury of not even knowing that I have a mindset. And thought about it a little further and thought that, well, I guess if I have a mindset, it would be maybe what makes it different than the mindset of someone who is not white. I thought about 3 things. First of all, if I live my life and I don't screw up, I have the confidence that things are going to go pretty well for me. If I live my life and I do screw up, I still have the confidence that things are going to go pretty well for me. And if I can do certain things really well, I have a really good shot of living a great life. And I think that it's that confidence that gives me the ability to take risks that other people might not be able to take. And those risks can be risks like, I'm gonna go up and talk to that guy, or I'm just gonna walk into that room where I am not invited and pretend that I belong there. And those are the kind of risks that I took at the beginning of starting my business that enabled it to get off the ground.
So I don't know that I would say that there's a mindset necessarily. I mean, you know, I have insecurities just like everybody else does. Maybe not with, except for you perhaps, but I appreciate your confidence. But you know, it's interesting though, because what you say bears out in reality, right? And I see it with our kids. I've got two sons in college and a daughter in grade school. And there's no doubt that there's an advantage for them just because they are who they are. You know, if they've got a little something special, it's going to move them even further than their peers. If they've got a problem, they're going to find resources, whether it's me or folks in my network, who are going to help them out of it. And not everybody's got that safety net, and it's a tremendous advantage for them. It's a tremendous advantage for us.
I would agree with everything that these guys said, especially Mitch. I could, you know, those words could probably come out of my mouth. But I'll add that I'm not sure it's so much of a mindset as much as it is just an ignorance. And somehow that ignorance breeds that confidence. When right out of college, I joined Teach for America. I was in one of their very early core groups. And I joined because I realized that the education that I had, I grew up in Livingston, the education that I had received was a gift. I didn't try, trust me, I did not try. And yet, here I was, graduating from the University of Wisconsin, really having not done much except sort of go through life and do exactly what was supposed to happen next. And I realized, certainly through that education, I finally embraced it, realized that that not everybody has that same chance. So I wanted to give that education that was given to me to others. You know, what's happened between then and now? I'm not sure, because since then, right, I've had a very varied career where doors have literally just sprung open, where it has been very easy to make those connections. So again, I'm not, you know, I don't know, you say mindset and it sounds somewhat deliberate, but to me, ignorance sort of means it's a very sort of, you know, you're not trying to have that mindset. It's just something that just that's just kind of there.
Yeah, and so full disclosure, we all live in South Orange, Maplewood. So, I don't know, maybe there's just even a certain perspective that's there, and these are towns that are touted as, being very diverse. And, Bill, you've talked about being very intentional about moving there and the kids going to public school and being, in a diverse environment, things like that. Doug's daughters and my third son go to school together. My oldest and Bill's oldest played baseball together. So, a lot of points of connection here. But I know that our kids, and while the district is, the school is diverse on one hand, oftentimes you still see black kids with black kids and white kids with white kids. Now, people will cross date and everyone's dating each other, so people are fine with it in that context. But why do you think we still see, and we're going to kind of jump to a related point in a second, but why do you think that, at that level, in a town where people have that mindset around diversity and inclusion, all that kind of stuff, why do you still see people just kind of together in their own silos?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. There's no question that, and you see with the children, that they do kind of group themselves together, usually a long race, not always, but usually. And you're right, Jill. I mean, we've spoken about, the intentionality around our moving to Maplewood in the first place was to expose our children to a lifestyle that I didn't have. I mean, I lived a very white upbringing. I was in a community where we had, my high school class was a huge high school class, not as big as Columbia, but pretty big, over 400 kids. We had 2 African-American children in our graduating class. And I just knew this was not the way life should be. It's not the way life should be. It's not the way I'm going to be able to teach my kids how to interact with their community. And so that's why we were dead set on a diverse community. And one of the things we talk about sports a lot, and it's kind of an Achilles heel for me. I mean, I kind of go to that because it's something I can relate to pretty easily. But one of the advantages I think that our oldest son in particular had at Columbia was he played multiple sports. And the baseball team was predominantly, though not exclusively, white, but the basketball team he played on was almost exclusively black. And he was, of course, one of the only white players on the team. And to be able to migrate between the different communities in the town, I think provided him with a tremendous advantage that I think will serve him well. And that was one of the reasons why we moved to that community. I wouldn't want to move to the community and then uproot my children from that goal.
Mm-hmm.
That's a difficult question. I think ultimately, people gravitate to people who are like them and who they're comfortable with culturally. And I think especially in high school, or maybe it starts in middle school, in the super kind of awkward years, right, where nobody wants to be more awkward. And what's more awkward than being the only one, right? Of a white kid going up to the black table, or a black kid going up to the white table.
How do you get the white and the black table in the first place?
I don't know. That's a great
Right,
question.
and I think it's
And I'm sure books have been written about it. Unfortunately, books that I haven't read yet.
It's really poignant because, again, Columbia is this big school. My second son went to the Columbia High School prom with a young woman. He does not go to Columbia High School, so all of his friends were there. He wanted to go to the prom. Managed to get someone to invite him. She happens to be white. And when you look at the photo, there were probably 100 kids all in someone's backyard in that kind of pre-prom thing. And when you look at the panoramic photo, I think there were maybe 4 black kids, maybe, kids who were not white. And again, Columbia is 56% black. So trying to figure out just why it is that still in a community where everyone says, and the parents all say they value diversity, how do we still end up like that?
Well, I've asked my kids about it. My kids can't answer that question. So if our kids can't answer that question, my daughters all have friends who are black. They're probably, they have more white friends than black friends. I don't see who they sit with at the lunch tables, but we do have these conversations around diversity and inclusion, and my kids typically just sort of blow them off and say, oh my gosh, here you guys go again talking about this stuff that we just don't care about. So it's interesting that we're talking about it, and yet I'm not sure our kids really care about it or are affected by it.
Right. Mitch, anything?
Well, I very skillfully skipped my turn.
We're just talking.
But when it comes to introductions, I think that people who share a culture also share a shorthand that makes it easier to communicate with each other. And there's no single white culture, and there's no single black culture. But when you go to meet people for the first time, I think, at least I have the belief that I probably will have more in common with the white person, all other things being equal. And so I may gravitate towards that. I don't know how that maintains itself in a high school cafeteria, but I do think that that might lead to why it maintains itself in a company, because how often do you hear the phrase corporate culture? And most older companies have a corporate culture, and that culture came from a time when the people in charge were all white males. So if you have that shorthand with the people in charge, you're going to be more likely to be able to communicate to them, and that's going to lead them to believe that you are more competent, and it's going to help you climb that corporate ladder more quickly. And it's totally unintentional, but it's there.
And I very much appreciate your honesty in saying that, hey, when you walk into a room, you may be more likely to feel comfortable. I find it really interesting that we evaluate kind of fit, or even the expectation of fit, just on race or being a woman. So there's probably a whole lot more that I have in common with Bill Craze and a love for sports and the passion for sports and the disregard for what people think when we're yelling at our kids to do better when they're on the field, than you would with the kind of artsy theater performing person.
Don't paint me with a broad brush here, Jill.
My son never struck out, and the one or two times that he struck out, Bill was like, you're the leadoff batter. You don't strike out. That's not what you're supposed to do. And so I get it. But I just want us to think about this a lot, because as we talk about why it is that women of color entrepreneurs have difficulty getting access or getting into the room, and I think, Doug, your point about it not necessarily being intentional, but there's kind of an ignorance, maybe, that people are just not acknowledging that we're excluding people, although not intentional, but the effect is the same because we're stuck in fit and culture and who's comfortable, and that often just being based on they look like me, it's another man, it's another white person.
Yeah, I think your point about comfort, we talk to our kids about this all the time. Why the hell does everybody have to be so comfortable, right? People kind of complain. Wherever they are, they complain that something on their plane isn't quite right, or the Wi-Fi is out. This miraculous thing, you're flying through the air and you could get Wi-Fi and now it's out. Shocking. But it seems like it's sort of this irony that kind of all these corporate titans or white men who are in business who think they have all this business prowess, they walk into a room and they walk to the people that make them the most comfortable, and that's just the way it works. I mean, I've retrained myself to walk into a room and walk up to the person that will likely make me feel the most uncomfortable, or where I am the only one, because I know that for very selfish reasons, all those people have a lot more to offer me than just another white guy. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish place and hung out with lots of Jewish people for a really long time, and that got me to a certain place. both professionally, but it didn't really get me any place new intellectually. And that to me is the goal, is to get someplace better intellectually, spiritually, all those things. And always gravitating to the person makes you the most comfortable is really sort of wimpy. And in the end, it's the thing that could really provide you with probably, the most good in the end.
Yeah, but again, it's reality. It's what we all do. I want to kind of go back to you on the point about growing up in this Jewish community, and point that you mentioned to me about being Jewish. There was, the culture of giving and doing charity work, and many of the people who were the recipients of this charity were people in lower income communities, often Black. And that was kind of your perspective, or what you saw, the Black people that you saw, that was it. How did that even, shape your view of Black people in general?
It made me, ultimately made me want to go teach in an inner city, somewhere in the country through Teach for America. And I think it made me want to sort of give back in a more significant way, in a way that wasn't just here, take $1, here, take some clothes that we're donating. It really was a matter of helping to improve people's lives sort of systemically. That if somebody can have that education is really the best road to success. But it was still sort of it still shaped my thought as sort of Black people being sort of an other, someplace else, right? I didn't teach in Newark. I taught in Houston. There was always sort of this sense of someplace else, that Black people are sort of outside of my community.
Let's talk about this concept of privilege for a minute. And it was interesting, on both the earlier panels, there was a reference to privilege and people feeling like they have had privilege. And there are many, many people in this room who are women of color who did have, by most standards, a privileged background and upbringing. But we hear the concept of white privilege. What does that mean when you hear it? How does that make you feel? And I want to kind of then talk about that continuum of privilege that I think was Kayla referenced earlier.
I definitely feel defensive when I hear the term white privilege. It is not a compliment. Privilege can be a compliment. White privilege is not a compliment. However, I've really had a lot of cause to think about it over the last few weeks since I've been invited to the panel. And I believe, just to tie a couple things that my co-panelists have said here together, is that white privilege is the complete ignorance of the confidence that you have to take risks. Most people who have white privilege are completely ignorant of the fact that they have it, and that ignorance in itself is privilege.
Yeah, I think Mitch hit the nail right on the head. I too bristle at the term white privilege, more so when I was younger, less so now, and I'll tell you why. I didn't grow up in a particularly privileged background. I was the first in my family to go to college. I grew up in a family business that, I heard some of the stories from some of the entrepreneurs earlier. I kind of relate to it. One was talking about being homeless. Well, we weren't homeless, but there were a lot of hot dogs and beans for dinner, that's for sure. And I had a sister who is severely disabled. She has cerebral palsy, she's cognitively very impaired, she's in a wheelchair, and lived with our family. So that really kind of, colored the way I grew up. And I didn't think for a second that I was necessarily privileged as I think of that term. But of course, as I gain professionally, I see that there's no question but that I'm privileged, and it's for no other reason than the color of my skin. And whether it's explicitly or implicitly, it's not deserved, but it's out there. And it makes me really uncomfortable. I'll share one kind of anecdote, and it's not necessarily relating to white privilege, but to privilege generally. About 20 years ago, when I was a young partner in our firm, one of the things I was responsible for was recruiting the summer associates that we would hire as lawyers after that. And I was young enough then so that I was actually a halfway decent basketball player, not very good, but halfway decent. And we would get together and play ball after work with the group of the young guys. And one of them happened to be a basketball player from college and was now in law school. And as I'm coming down the court on one particular play, and it's me against him with the basket on the other side, and I put up this beautiful shot, goes right over his head, goes right in the basket. And I am thrilled. This is my high point of my basketball career. I just dropped in this teardrop over Raheem, who played basketball at the University of Vermont, and I am talking smack. And one of the other guys, who happens to be his classmate, says to me, "Do you think maybe Raheem let you have that basket?" Son of a bitch, are you kidding me? That's exactly what happened. Raheem, and it was like devastating. Yeah, I mean, and it made me realize, in kind of a silly sort of way, that I was the beneficiary of privilege in that case, and it made me feel terrible. Still does.
I personally think white privilege needs kind of a new branding campaign. It just sort of needs a different name, in my opinion, because in the way I see it, is it's sort of the absence of something. It's the absence of getting hassled your entire life. Right? It's the absence of being, thrown up against a police car because you're smoking weed in a elementary school parking lot and a cop shows up. Right? It's you grow up in a white suburb, you hide it, you play kind of the respectful person, and they let you go. This is really something that me and my other white friends who were doing Teach for America sort of came to realize as after we were taught a whole bunch, we were sitting around, and we'd constantly wonder, what's different between us and the students that we're teaching, who are all kids of color. And we all grew up in white suburbs. And we realized, and we had some of the smartest kids we'd ever met. And what we realized was that we got chances. We got second chances. We got third chances. We got fourth chances. So, and that has always stuck with me. So in this, the first thing you hear when white privilege comes up is some white guy saying kind of what Bill said. I didn't grow up with privilege. I didn't have any money. But to me, really what it is, it's the absence of that hassle and kind of this, being able to take a somewhat smooth path through life, kind of regardless of what you do.
Yeah, I mean, the absence of not getting stopped when you're just driving in a car, the privilege of not having to have the conversation with your black children to have a protocol of what to do if stopped by the police, and something that's even very basic that a lot of people don't think about, not having to think about your hair like this. When, in fact, 10 years or so ago, many of us felt that we had to chemically alter our hair just to be acceptable in a professional environment. So I think that that continuum of privilege, there certainly is one, right? Because it is not just about the wealth and having everything given to you, but it is, and Doug, I think that's a great point that you bring up. It's the absence of having to think about certain things, and for that having to be part of your world. Do you guys feel that we're open enough as a society so that you have the ability to talk about these issues? How is it for you? Oftentimes people of color feel very emboldened to talk about, our issues, challenges, things like that, and that's okay. It can be, that's acceptable. If you kind of talk about your issues, it's kind of like, what do you mean? Why are you telling us this? So just some thoughts on that. How do we start to break through that so that everyone has an opportunity to share and talk about what's going on?
I do. Sometimes when I complain about things, all sorts of people just throw out the phrase, white people problems. That's it. That means shut up, stop complaining. But I do think that their political correctness has a message that I generally agree with, but often has a delivery that can be counterproductive and can cause fear in people wanting to speak openly, can cause a backlash, and is something that I think if everyone worked on talking about political correctness and language more openly, then language wouldn't be one of the things that we focus on, because language is a very small part of a larger problem, and we tend to really focus on language.
Yeah, and even toward the end of language, just a note, since we're kind of educating and creating awareness in this space. Oftentimes people are afraid to use the term black. Most white people will say African American. Recognize that African American does not necessarily encompass people that are Caribbean, people that are African, etc. So that there is, saying black is not a bad thing. And oftentimes I use the term black, meaning everyone, to be inclusive, versus African American. If you call someone who is a black person but who's from Europe, from London, etc., they're not African American. So just a note out there as we're talking about the concept of language, but something that, I don't know, would you be comfortable in even asking, like, hey, is black the right thing? I don't want to say black, is African American the right
Well, I
thing?
would ask you, Jill. I wouldn't ask other people, that's for sure.
Hey, Jill,
But now I know, that's good, But it's interesting because, language it's a funky thing, right? I mean, finding the right nomenclature is so hard. That route is filled with landmines every place we go. For folks who want to kind of do the right thing, I feel like I'm always doing the wrong thing. I feel like I'm always saying the wrong phrase, whatever that may be. But on the other hand, you think about where political correctness has taken us. I mean, from Negroes, if you will, to, and I hope no one's filming this because I don't want to trend. All right, so, but that's what was an acceptable term, 50 years ago. I mean, thank God we've had some political correctness out there that's changed the nomenclature that has at least allowed us to, get on, kind of the right playing field, so to speak. But it can be divisive too, and it can be, and people resent it, right? I mean, so Doug's going to explain it. Help me out, Doug.
Thank you, Bill.
I gotta stop talking.
Get out.
Someone Jill just
He's
said
like a
I'm
class.
on
He's
the
like too deep. About to step.
Like Mitch, I do believe political correctness has gotten us lots of places, right? Without people correcting others as to how you can better respect someone else's perspective, we would be back in God knows what year, right? That it helps propel us, it helps move us forward. At the same time, I do think, particularly recently, it's gotten in the way, and I'm not even sure it's political correctness that's gotten in the way, as much as everybody's gone to sort of this default that the other person is bad. That if somebody says something, or if somebody makes some remark to me that sounds sort of disparaging to Jews, they're anti-Semitic.
Cancel
Or,
culture.
right. Or the second somebody says something that may be out of place, from the black perspective, they're racist or sexist or homophobic, whatever it is. And that and I think was it Kayla who talked about it earlier? Talked about it very eloquently about not leaving it alone, but also not combating it. Kind of taking it from a perspective of, hey, that person may just be ignorant. They may just not know the right word. Who knows? But let's use that as a stepping off point for discussion. And in reverse, right? Anybody, I should not have been as sort of nervous and afraid talking to Jill on the phone that one day. I shouldn't have been so worried about saying the wrong thing, because that worry caused me to do all sorts of stupid things, right? I should assume, right, that Jill is not going to think that I'm racist based on some stupid, comment that I made that was just made from a place truly of ignorance. In many ways, I think the word ignorant should just come back, and that we should all sort of embrace it as, yes, I'm ignorant about lots and lots of things, but that doesn't make me a bad person, and I shouldn't think I'm a bad person because of that.
Hashtag it, Doug.
Yes. Hashtag we are all ignorant.
So speed round question here. What is it that, just actually say one thing, I don't know if that can be a speed though. I'd just like to hear one thing that each of you has done to, again, really quickly, because I'm getting the time signal over there, thank you, Alita, to open the door for someone else who does not look like you. Just one quick thing, one quick example.
I've actively sought out employees that don't look like me to the point where nobody looks like me at my company. There are 3 white people out of 180. I did have a struggle.
Witness.
I did have a struggle hiring black people, mainly because I believe a lot of the positions were in sewing, and it was in my community in North Newark was not a job that people wanted to go and work at for a career. But we ended up hiring a lot of people in our office, and that was really the result of seeking that out and specifically hiring black people.
Thank you.
Sharing a meal, taking people to lunch, taking them to breakfast, and asking them questions about them. You know, finding out about their background, find common links between yourself and people who don't look like you, and you know, dive into those differences.
Thank you.
We spend a lot of time in the Adirondacks, and lots of kids up there want internships in the city, free, but they can't pay for it. So we've invited whoever wants to stay in our guest room to stay there, so that they could take advantage of these internships that they otherwise would have never, ever been able to take advantage of.
Share one thing that, one insight that you've gained from the conversation today. Doug, let's go back to you and come back to this.
Oh, I'm not quick. One insight. That's a good question. I actually, to be totally honest, I need processing time.
I'm ignorant. Thank you, Doug.
One insight that came to me while I was sitting here and after listening to some of the panels this morning is that there are opportunities out there for everybody, and they're not necessarily easier to attain for different types of people, and also different types of people don't necessarily go after them with the same gusto, and that could be a reason why there isn't as much diversity and inclusion in companies.
So let's start with you on that point. How is it that, or what do you feel that white men, people in your positions, could do to help to propel others and to open doors of access? Something.
I believe that helping to educate other white men on a few things. Doug uses a word before, which is selfish, which really resonated with me, because a big reason that we're diverse is it's selfish. A diverse group is always going to outperform a homogenous group if there's inclusion, always. And to educate people that that is a scientifically proven fact would be helpful.
So I think Mitch is absolutely right. Diversity is a tactic to the goal of inclusion. Inclusion is where you want to get to. I mean, we've all heard the phrase, diversity is being asked to the dance, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And so you got to actually make that step. Diversity sometimes becomes just numbers on a page, and I think we need to get beyond that. On the other hand, if you don't have the numbers on the page, you're not going to get to the inclusion part.
I think it's incumbent upon us, upon advocates, to go talk to other white guys. Since meeting Jill and sort of getting a lot of the language directly from Jill, I've spoken to all of my friends about this and kind of brought them around to where, yeah, they need to really purposefully make sure that they are succeeding at inclusion. And these are all liberal guys. They believe in every liberal cause. And you ask them kind of who's on, and they're in some fairly significant positions. You ask them kind of who's on their executive team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They say they try, but they're mostly white men. And after the conversation, they're either just appeasing me or they truly are sort of motivated to sort of make that a success. And in part, I use Jill's direct words, so I can't take credit for this. It's just a matter of putting yourself in these networks that are outside of your usual networks and going to places where you are the only one and making yourself uncomfortable.
Awesome. Bill, do you want to say one?
Just want to make one point about diversity. You know, I think it's great when we can be diverse for the right reasons, right? Because it's good to mirror the society. It's good to be able to traffic in different ideas. And I think it's important, though, sometimes we realize that there's a business benefit to being diverse. I mean, Mitch points out that there's scientific evidence supporting that. On the other hand, if that's the only reason you're diverse, that is for the business reason, I don't think it's going to succeed. I think the risk you have is you're not going to have retention because you're not invested in the people, and you need to be invested in the people.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, so it's almost time for lunch. We have one very quick thing, which is great. And I'm very excited about this. So as you know, this is all about a movement. Oh, there's steps over here. Or just jump off, whichever. So this is all about a movement and getting people involved, right? We want people to actively get involved in what we're doing. And there was a person I met, and again, I've been meeting people all over. I went to the Propelify conference and spoke, and someone came up to me afterward and said, hey, you know what, I'd like to get to know you more. And so I've been doing a lot of that kind of thing recently. And he, after a few conversations, he's involved in a really interesting business, and he ended up making an offer that I wanted him to share with us today. Timothy, where are you? Come on up. And Timothy right away just jumped on board and said, hey, how can I be helpful? And he was then very intentional about thinking about this movement and how he can support it with a new product that they're launching.
Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Nishimura. I'm in business development with Cross River Network. We manage all of the out-of-home advertising opportunities for New York Waterway. So as many of you know, people that ride the ferry and commute on a daily basis between New York and New Jersey tend to be high income earners. They tend to be in positions of influence. So we, as a company, in thinking of how we can be intentionally inclusive, decided that with the launch of our new charging station product in the terminals in Weehawken at Port Imperial and at Pier 79 in Midtown Manhattan, that we would allow for a block grant of advertising credit to women of color-led organizations. It'll be a $15,000 grant, and it will support various organizations. We wanted to give a start for younger companies that wouldn't necessarily have the means when you're looking at the different marketing opportunities to avail themselves of out-of-home advertising. So this gives them a little bit of a place so that you can create those moments of serendipity that you normally don't get to explore when everything is so metrics driven, especially in marketing and advertising this day. So I'm terribly pleased to announce this, and I look forward to working with all the different organizations.
And so you see, that's a photo there, and we're going to have some space, and we will be using those with our Success Circles entrepreneurs and making this opportunity available to them. So if any of the entrepreneurs in the room are not familiar with our Success Circles program, you will become familiar, and I encourage you to apply. So we're going to move into lunch. Before we go into lunch, I just want to make sure we thank our sponsors. Fortis Lux Financial is our presenting champion sponsor. Portfolio came in huge just when we needed the support to get things going. A host of other sponsors that, again, have been hugely supportive. Golden Seeds has been there with us from the beginning of this and has fueled a lot of the work that we've done on the side of capital access through the Angel Network. So look to hear more on that later on. NJEDA, and we're going to hear from, I'm not going to steal the thunder because we're going to hear from NJEDA shortly, and our other supporters. So thank you so much for all the support. So what's going to happen now is they're going to bring the food in, but in order to bring the food in, they need everyone to get up, which presents an opportunity for us all to network and get to know each other. So we'll be back for lunch shortly.
That's right.